Imagine a young sailor, barely 18 years old, sitting in a dimly lit shop in a foreign port. The smell of salt water is still on his skin. He has been at sea for months. He is far from home, far from everything familiar. And in a few minutes, he is going to make a decision that will stay with him for the rest of his life. He's going to get a tattoo, not because it is trendy, not because it is fashionable, but because every sailor before him did the same thing. Because that mark on his skin will mean something. It will say he survived. It will say he was there. It will say he belongs to the sea. That ritual, that moment, that tradition, it did not start last year or last decade. It goes back centuries. And today we're going to trace it all the way from the beginning. Welcome. Today we are diving deep into one of the most fascinating and overlooked corners of American military history. We are talking about tattoo culture in the United States Navy. Where it came from, what it meant, how it changed, and why it still matters today. Let's go all the way back. When European sailors first began making contact with the indigenous peoples of the Pacific, they encountered something that completely stopped them in their tracks. The native people of Polynesia, New Zealand, Samoa, and the islands of the South Pacific, they carried art on their bodies. Deeply meaningful, spiritually significant, intricately designed marks that told the story of who they were, what they had done, and where they belonged in the world. These were not random decorations. Every line, every pattern, every symbol carried meaning. It spoke of lineage, of courage, of spiritual protection. And when sailors from Britain, France, and the early American colonies saw this, something clicked inside them. Something resonated. The word tattoo itself comes directly from the Polynesian word tata, and it was the great explorer Captain James Cook who brought the practice into European consciousness when he returned from his voyages in the 1760s and 1770s. His crew had seen it. Some of them had experienced it, and they brought it back home with them. But here's the thing. Long before American sailors ever reached the Pacific, men who worked the sea already had a complicated relationship with their bodies and the marks they put on them. Sailors in the colonial era, men who sailed merchant vessels and early naval ships, they were already branding themselves with rough, homemade marks. Crude anchors drawn with a needle and gunpowder ash. Initials pressed into the skin with a pen dipped in ink made from soot. These early tattoos were often about identification. If a sailor drowned and his body washed ashore, a tattoo might be the only way anyone could figure out who he was. In that sense, getting a tattoo was not just tradition. It was practical. It was survival thinking. But as the United States Navy began to form its identity in the late 18th century and the early 19th century, the tattoo started to take on a deeper layer of meaning. It became a badge, a sign that you were not just any man. You were a sailor. Now let us talk about what those early American sailors were actually getting tattooed on their bodies, because it is fascinating. The anchor was king. It represented stability, strength, and a connection to the sea. A sailor with an anchor on his arm was saying, without using any words, that he was grounded in his profession, that he was serious, that the sea was not just his job, it was his identity. Then came the swallow, and this one had rules attached to it. You could only earn a swallow tattoo after sailing 5,000 miles. Get 2 swallows, and you had sailed 10,000. For men who spent months at sea with no GPS, no satellite communication, no way to call home, those tiny birds tattooed on the chest were proof of experience. They were resume written in ink. The rope around the wrist told the world you were a deckhand. The full rigged ship on the chest meant you had sailed around Cape Horn, one of the most treacherous stretches of ocean on the planet, where the Atlantic and Pacific meet in a violent, constant storm. A dragon on the body meant you had crossed into waters east of the international dateline. A turtle crossing the equator. A golden dragon for crossing the dateline. The nautical star to help you find your way home. Every single tattoo had a story, a requirement, a meaning. This was not decoration. This was documentation. And the community enforced it. If you claimed a tattoo you had not earned, you would hear about it from your shipmates. There was honor in these marks. There was accountability. Now, let us move into the 19th century, because this is where things really start to get interesting. The United States Navy expanded dramatically after the Civil War. The country was rebuilding itself. The military was being reorganized and restructured. And the sailors of this era, many of them young men from poor backgrounds with very few opportunities on land, they were flocking to the ports looking for work and adventure. Port cities like Norfolk, Boston, San Diego, and Honolulu became hubs of sailor culture. And in every single one of those cities, tattoo shops began to appear near the docks. These were rough places, make no mistake, but they were also community spaces. Men would go in together, sometimes get matching tattoos, sometimes get tattoos that reflected the ship they served on, the battles they had fought, the oceans they had crossed. The tattoo artists who served these sailors were often former sailors themselves. They understood the culture. They understood what mattered. And some of them became genuinely legendary. One of the most important figures in early American tattoo history is a man named Martin Hildebrandt. He began tattooing sailors during the Civil War, traveling between military camps and naval bases to mark soldiers and sailors on both sides of the conflict. And after the war, he opened a shop in New York City. Many historians consider him to be the first professional tattoo artist in American history. But it was another man, Samuel O'Reilly, who truly changed everything. In 1891, O'Reilly patented the first electric tattoo machine. Before this invention, every single tattoo was done by hand, by needle, one puncture at a time. The electric machine made tattoos faster, more precise, and more accessible. The whole industry shifted overnight. Now tattoo artists could take on more clients. They could create more detailed designs. And sailors, who often had very limited time in port, could get a quality tattoo in a fraction of the time it used to take. But with the growth of tattoo culture came a backlash. Not everyone was thrilled about the direction things were going. As the Navy professionalized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, officers and commanders began looking at tattooed, enlisted men with some suspicion. There was a class divide at work here. Officers, who came from more educated and often wealthier backgrounds, generally did not get tattoos. Enlisted men did. And that distinction fed into a broader cultural prejudice against body modification. Tattoos became associated unfairly but powerfully with rough men, criminals, social outcasts. Newspapers ran stories about tattooed criminals and circus performers. The respectable classes looked down on the practice. And that stigma would follow tattoo culture in America for decades. But inside the Navy, something different was happening. Even as the outside world judged them, sailors continued to tattoo. They continued to honor the tradition. Because within the community, a tattooed sailor was a real sailor. Someone who had done the miles. Someone who had earned it. The civilian world's disapproval did not change that. And then came the World Wars. During World War I and World War II, millions of American men entered military service. Many of them had never considered getting a tattoo before. But now they were in the Navy, surrounded by tradition, surrounded by culture, facing the very real possibility that they might not come home. And so they got tattooed. The imagery of this era is some of the most iconic in American tattoo history. Eagles with their wings spread wide, anchors wrapped in rope, the words mother or mom inside a heart, ships sailing through stormy seas, pinup girls, American flags, the names of sweethearts back home, the names of ships they served on. There's something deeply moving about those tattoos when you think about what they represented. A young man, maybe 19 years old, maybe 20, heading into a war he might not survive, choosing to carry something permanent on his body. Something that connected him to home, to love, to identity, to his country. Norman Collins, who became known as Sailor Jerry, was the defining tattoo artist of this era. Based in Honolulu, Hawaii, which was the gateway for American sailors heading into the Pacific theater of the war, Sailor Jerry combined the bold lines and strong imagery of traditional American tattooing with the precision and philosophy he had absorbed from Japanese tattoo masters. He created a style that was completely his own, and it became the defining visual language of naval tattoo culture for a generation. His work was dramatic. It was masculine. It was bold. A Sailor Jerry tattoo looked like it belonged on a man who had been somewhere and done something. And to a sailor about to ship out into the Pacific, with all the uncertainty that entailed, that kind of statement mattered. The post-war period brought another shift. When the veterans of World War II came home, they brought their tattoos with them. But civilian society was not entirely sure how to receive them. The Cold War-era America of the 1950s and early 1960s was focused on conformity, on suburban respectability, on blending in. And a tattooed arm was not exactly blending in. At the same time, the Navy itself was going through internal debates about discipline, appearance, and the image it wanted to project. There were informal pressures on sailors to keep their tattoos modest and covered. The wild sailor in the port city getting inked before deployment was not exactly the polished image the Navy Public Relations Department wanted to promote. But you cannot kill a tradition that deep. Through the 1960s and 1970s, tattoo culture survived. It evolved. It absorbed new influences from the counterculture movement, from rock and roll, from the growing biker subculture. And in the Navy, it kept going, driven by the same forces it had always been driven by. Brotherhood, identity, pride, the need to mark the extraordinary experiences of a life lived at sea. Then came the 1980s and 1990s, and everything started to change for American tattoo culture broadly. Television brought tattoo artists into living rooms across the country. Artists like Ed Hardy, who had trained under Sailor Jerry himself, elevated tattooing into a recognized art form. Academic interest in the history and anthropology of body modification began to grow. The tattoo started its long journey from stigma to mainstream acceptance. For the Navy, this shift had real consequences. As tattooing became more socially acceptable, the Navy had to reckon with the fact that recruits were arriving at basic training with tattoos already on their bodies. The question was no longer just what tattoos meant within naval culture. The question was now how the institution would manage body modification policy for a changing generation of Americans. In the 2000s and 2010s, the Navy went back and forth on its tattoo regulations in ways that created genuine confusion and some real frustration among sailors and potential recruits. At various points, there were restrictions on tattoos that were visible on the neck, on the hands, on the face. There were size limits and content restrictions. Tattoos that were deemed offensive or extremist were prohibited. Sleeves, meaning tattoos that covered an entire arm, were at various times restricted and then permitted again. In 2016, the Navy updated its policy in a significant way, relaxing many of the restrictions that had been put in place in earlier years. Full-sleeve tattoos were allowed. Tattoos below the knee and below the elbow were generally permitted. The Navy had essentially acknowledged what sailors had known for centuries, that tattoos and naval service were inseparable parts of the same culture. And today, if you walk through any naval base in the United States, you will see that living tradition all around you. You will see sailors with traditional Sailor Jerry-style anchors on their arms, honoring a design language that goes back 100 years. You will see modern geometric tattoos and watercolor styles and hyperrealistic portraiture. You will see tattoos in Japanese style, in tribal style, in American traditional and neo-traditional. But you will also still see the classics. The swallow, the anchor, the compass rose, the nautical star, the pinup girl, the eagle, the mother in a heart. Those images did not go away because they were never just images. They were symbols of something that does not change, no matter how the world around it shifts. They are symbols of service, of sacrifice, of time spent far from home in conditions most people will never experience, of bonds formed between men and women who trusted each other with their lives, of oceans crossed and storms survived and ports visited and enemies faced. A tattoo on a sailor's body is a map of their life in the Navy. Every mark is a chapter. Every image is a memory. Every line is a story. And here is what makes this history so profound, so worth understanding. The tattoo was never really about rebellion, even when the outside world saw it that way. It was never really about toughness, even when it signaled toughness to strangers. At its core, the naval tattoo was always about belonging, about being part of something larger than yourself, about saying, Without words, I was here. I did this. I was part of this brotherhood. From the first Polynesian warrior whose patterns inspired a European sailor centuries ago, to the young recruit today sitting in a shop near the base with their heart pounding, the tradition has never broken. It has bent and evolved and absorbed new influences. But it has never broken, because some things are bigger than regulations. Some things are bigger than fashion trends and social stigma and the opinions of people who have never been to sea. Some things are written into the DNA of a culture so deeply that no policy memo or public relations strategy can ever fully erase them. The naval tattoo is one of those things. And the next time you see a veteran with an anchor on their wrist or a swallow on their chest, you're not just seeing a piece of body art. You're seeing history. You are seeing centuries of tradition, of sacrifice, of identity, of pride, worn openly and permanently on human skin. That is not just culture. That is legacy. And it is one of the most remarkable, most human, most American stories you will ever find.